Whether you love it or hate it, Pokemon is the single most profitable franchise of all time, dwarfing the vast majority of its competition. It stands to reason then that the Pokemon Company must be doing something very right. But in spite of decades of success, Pokemon's core series has long been criticised for having stagnated, and this is for good reason. Though there have been experiments in the form of countless spin-offs, the mainline games have followed the same mechanical and narrative structures since its inception in the 90s. Typically, the series has added small wrinkles and gimmicks over time, but none of them have been particularly transformative to the majority of players. And while there's an argument for if it ain't broke, don't fix it, it's also fair to have expected some significant evolution from an IP that's been printing insane amounts of money for over 20 years. I personally became pretty checked out of the Pokemon formula after Gold and Silver, and have only dipped my toe into some of the games that came out after, out of curiosity. I'm not particularly invested, so when I play an hour or two of, say, Sword and Shield, and I realise it's the same song and dance yet again, I move on without giving it much thought. Recently though, I've found myself thinking about the series and all its wasted potential, and that's thanks to another game that hones in on just how much more interesting things could be. If only there were more willingness from Pokemon's creators, or rather their corporate overlords, to take bigger risks. That game is Bugsnax.
Welcome to the island of Bugsnax.
Kind of bargain, kind of snack. Try to catch it in your trap. Feed somebody and you'll see we are whatever we eat. Find them hiding in the sand, tearing up a ketchup patch. Hunters not too violent and discover it's Bugsnax.
Bugsnax is misleading in more ways than one, and perhaps that's why it's been slept on for the most part. At a glance, it's easy to assume it's intended for a younger audience, or that it might lack depth of one kind or another, when that's truly not the case. What may not have helped is that the marketing wasn't particularly informative about how the game would actually play, when its mechanics are as interesting as its surprisingly well-crafted story is. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the Pokemon comparison isn't unique to me. Plenty of videos have called Bugsnax creepy Pokemon, weird Pokemon, or another of the many clickbaity variations of similar terms. However, in my opinion, this approach is overly reductive, and honestly it's also pretty misleading. In truth, Bugsnax is something much more intriguing than a Pokemon knockoff. And as a game, it's a greater display of creativity than the core Pokemon series has been since its debut. Before we get into why, it's worth letting you know that this video will contain two distinct sections. Neither is going to be completely comprehensive, they're both just going to focus on the elements that I felt were most important or most interesting. The first will go into some of the mechanics of both Pokemon and Bugsnax, and will be free of story spoilers for either. The second will get into some interesting stuff Bugsnax does with its storytelling, and will contain some soft spoilers here and there for both. I'll be sure to give you a warning before the jump, in case you've heard enough and want to give the game a shot with its surprises uncompromised. With that out of the way, let's get started. Mechanically, Pokemon's formula is tried and true. At the centre of its gameplay is what's often referred to as a JRPG combat system. It's a term that's gotten less useful over time, but for the sake of brevity we'll use it for now. Essentially, the system entails both the player and their opponents taking turns to select actions from a menu. In most cases, they can be offensive, defensive, or regenerative, and the battle comes to an end once certain conditions are met. Usually that condition is that either the player's team or the enemy's team runs out of hit points, although in Pokemon, battles also end if a wild critter is captured. Typically, any game that uses this sort of turn-based combat as its foundation will add its own spin, and in the case of a series, iterate on it over time. Pokemon is no exception. In the early days, what depth there was in Pokemon's combat mostly stemmed from their typing. We all know the deal with this stuff: fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire. It's your traditional rock, paper, scissors scenario. Similar strengths and weaknesses apply to all types, except for when they don't, and pretty effectively encourage the player to create a diverse party. Over time, they've added further complexity through implementing more interesting moves with varied effects, creating more types, layering on additional systems like attaching items, berries, etc., and have also dabbled with the more gimmicky stuff like duo battles and hey, that Pokemon is big now. A ton of classics have walked a similar path, and plenty of great games are still utilising similar mechanics in an engaging way. Why Pokemon's combat falls flat for many is a discussion for another time, but it is at the very least functional and contains a lot of depth, though it's wasted in single player. It's actually not the fights that feel like a missed opportunity to me. Where I really feel shortchanged is with Pokemon's standout feature when compared to other JRPGs. Catching them all. Usually, role-playing games of Pokemon's type have a set cast, but where Pokemon struck gold was in letting the player fashion their own party from any combination of the most marketable bastards you've ever seen. This is great because it means we all have the choice between good Pokemon, like Cubone and Psyduck, or bad Pokemon, like Pikachu and Psyduck. Everyone will have their favourites and we'll end up with a unique team composition. Because of that, each person's playthrough has the potential to feel somewhat personalised. There's so much variety in how Pokemon look, the moves they have, and their places in the ecology of this world, and the scope of them has only gotten increasingly staggering over time, and it's hard not to be impressed by that. How did we catch them though? Beat them up, imprison them in a ball. Wound them, in the ball. Slap, get in the ball. Punch, in the ball. You're in the ball now. Everybody get in the ball. There's room for everyone in the ball. Now, I know you can fish for Pokemon, but let's be real, that's just walking through grass but with extra button presses. And I know you can go to the Safari Zone, but the only difference there is we throw a rock at this thing we want to enslave now. And I know there are different types of ball, but all they meaningfully impact is the likelihood that a dice roll will succeed. I also realise you can trade for Pokemon, but frankly, anyone who would trade away their precious creatures should be cut out of your life immediately. You cannot trust them. To me, this really sucks because Pokemon has a ton of interesting and weird lore regarding the behaviours of and interactions between its creatures. While we catch glimpses of it in spin-offs, the anime, and so on, in the main series, all of that stuff is basically relegated to Pokédex entries. And I really feel like when people say they're bored of the same old Pokemon formula, while the combat plays a role in their fatigue, it's the catching part that could improve things without totally reinventing the wheel. This is where Bugsnax comes in. In Bugsnax, combat isn't really a thing, it's all about the catching. Instead of Pokemon, we have adorable little food monsters who all have their own distinct behaviours, and these will factor into how we interact with them. It starts out simple. We're given a scanner, and we can scan a snack to learn a few things about it. This information will help us figure out potential approaches. Most usefully right now, we'll be able to see the scanned creature's route. We'll also discover pretty quickly that if we get too close, this little bugger's going to hide in a bush, having correctly determined that we're a threat to its well-being. When it comes to actually trapping these things, all we have to work with at this stage is a remote-activated net. Luckily for us, Strabby here has a short memory, so if we back off, he's going to go right back to his set path. So we can deploy our trap on its route, move away, and wait for the tiny fool to walk right into it. Right away then, we've learned that our presence will have an impact on a Bugsnax's actions. A Bugsnax? Bugsnaxes? Whatever. It's going to notice us, is what we've learned. We've also found out that there are places they can go where we can't get them, and if we weren't quick enough, we'll have learned that they don't stay stuck in our trap forever. With these basic concepts effectively conveyed, we're given another tool. A slingshot that fires what are essentially different types of lure. This chump, pulling a Lionel Richie on the ceiling of a nearby cave, is out of our reach, but cannot resist our smelly goop, and so we have another method for manipulating the behaviour of our delicious prey. This guy is far too hench for our basic net, but can't stand his own kind. So just like interfering governments, we can draw two of them into conflict with each other to get what we want. Over the course of the game, different behaviours and characteristics are introduced, as are extra tools. This one too fast? There's a tool for that. This guy is hiding in a jar. Not anymore, he isn't. Some even require interactions with different elements of their biomes. Others can wreck your stuff, and many will require a combination of approaches to capture. It's a marriage of Hitmanish clockwork level design and Ape Escape's gadget-based denial of freedoms, and these two things seem to go together perfectly. So while Bugsnax doesn't have an equivalent feature to Pokemon's battle system, it doesn't need one. The act of catching these things is entertaining enough all on its own. Arguably, its more puzzle-esque gameplay is a truer realization of Pokemon's original inspiration, which was, of course, catching bugs. Now imagine this sort of design being applied to a Pokemon game. The possibilities are basically endless. Rather than, or maybe as well as gadgets, your current Pokemon's moves could function as additional tools outside of battle. Attacks having a secondary use outside of combat isn't even a new idea, what with Cut, Flash, Fly, Surf, and so on, but the ways in which they're implemented have always been very limited. Suddenly, moves that bind, slow, confuse, or incapacitate can have extra utility, and might be worth keeping around even if they aren't especially effective in fights. This idea already opens up a lot of opportunities for interesting design, and that's without even mentioning how typing could impact things, or a specific Pokemon's physiology. And as mentioned earlier, many of the hundreds of creatures created for the series already have weird and interesting behaviours that could factor into this style of gameplay, instead of only being flavour text. This inflatable demon tries to carry children away, according to the Pokedex, but so far they haven't had the guts to back up their talk with action. Frankly, I don't want to live in a world where I can't use a human child as bait to lure in a freaky balloon monster. Imagine how rewarding it'll be when it finally pays off. The missing posters won't even bother us anymore. I've barely scratched the surface here in regards to the potential of Pokemon at least attempting this sort of direction, but as fun as that is to speculate about, let's not forget that Bugsnax already exists and is capitalizing on these kinds of ideas right now. So before we get into the story stuff, where there will be mild spoilers, I want you to know that the game is worth playing, and going in knowing as little as possible about its narrative elements can only enhance things for you really. It was free on PlayStation Plus a short while back, so if you grabbed it and haven't tried it, now is the time, but if you missed it there, it's well worth the asking price anyway. With that said, it's time to get on to part 2. As stated earlier, Bugsnax on its surface looks like there might not be much to it. At first glance, it seemed, at least to me, like a simple game with a quirky art style that would probably string together its gameplay with a functional, albeit not especially interesting story. I was quite wrong about that last bit. Like many fun stories do, it begins with mysteries. What are Bugsnax? Why does eating them turn you into a body horror nightmare? And where has the Muppet pioneer who started the colony on Snacktooth Island disappeared to? I found these questions grab me right away, and as our protagonist is an investigative journalist, we're given suitable motivation and fitting context for the journey. I won't spoil the payoff for these driving questions today, but rest assured they all paid off in satisfying ways. It was the mystery that sparked my interest then, but the characters who really stole the show. When I first met Filbo, pathetically squirming in the dirt, on the verge of starving to death due to his absolute incapability to provide for himself, I was like, wow man, finally a character I can relate to. Filbo is mayor of a ghost town, having been left in charge when the colony's true leader disappeared. Things fell apart shortly after, and all the other residents of Snaxburg went their separate ways. Because of this, we're given another goal to complement our search for answers, to get the gang back together. Over the course of the game, we'll meet the rest of the island's residents. Through interviews with them and through their side quests, we'll learn more about their personalities, their relationships with each other, and why each one chose to leave their old lives behind. They're all super memorable with distinct voice performances, mannerisms, and motivations. So they may look like the cast of a slightly nightmarish puppet show, but the quality of the writing managed to make these malformed Build-A-Bear creations feel more rounded and real to me than almost any big-budget, capital E emotional games out there. And that's a real feat when you consider that award winners like The Last of Us 2 had to resort to dog murder to get my shriveled heart to care at all. Not one of the Bugsnax crew felt like an afterthought, and by the time the credits rolled, there wasn't a single character I wasn't invested in. But if we turn our attention back to Pokemon again for a moment, to call the cast cookie cutter sort of feels like an understatement. We'll leave Mom behind at the tender age of too damn young to be out in the woods alone, get a Pokemon from Professor Tree, and meet a rival with annoyingly better hair than us. From there, we'll fight our way through the elemental spectrum while being hounded by a criminal organisation who commit far too many resources to pestering 10-year-olds. We'll beat the Elite Four, beat the bad guys, catch something super rare at the end, and maybe battle someone from a previous title as an endgame challenge. It's this story almost every single time. The bottom line is that beyond the draw of discovering new critters, there's rarely an element of Pokemon that really gets its hooks into the player. The characters and the journeys are always fundamentally the same, and the mystery is pretty much always centered around a mystical Pokemon that may or may not actually be God. I will admit, when I was a kid myself, the idea of being a kid who gets to roam a world full of cool monsters was very appealing, and that was enough on its own. I'm sure it still is to new players, but the magic of that concept is only effective once. Whatever a particular person's second game happens to be needs to offer something more, or else it's diminishing returns from then on. I'm confident at least some of you watching have felt these diminishing returns in full effect, and been left wondering whether you've just become old and bitter over time, whether you're no longer capable of enjoying yourself, having been ground down by years of tax returns and silently hating your spouse. But I am here to say, the problem isn't you. It's time to blame the Pokemon Company, and probably get counselling. When compared then, it's clear the two games are very different in regards to their storytelling. Pokemon tends to focus on hitting specific beats and sticking to its formula, which results in an A to B to C checklist of plot points that are only skin deep. Whereas Bugsnax has its driving questions as its base, and its well-realised characters to greatly elevate the storytelling. So not only are you following clues to solve a broader mystery, but you're also uncovering the stories of each of the island's inhabitants, which can themselves result in discovering things pertinent to the main plot. To be honest, it's hard to imagine Pokemon and Bugsnax being more different, which is why I wasn't a fan of the clickbaity way YouTube covered Bugsnax at release. Before we wrap up though, I actually want to draw attention to an aspect of world building where the two games are surprisingly similar, but the results for each somehow manage to be very different. It's sort of a running joke at this point that in Pokemon, the world is obsessed with Pokemon and almost nothing else. The glassy-eyed inhabitants of whatever region you're in will almost all talk about Pokemon, they all own Pokemon, especially in the earlier games. Even the towns themselves would have a Poke Center, a Pokemart, a Pokemon Gym, and basically nothing else. The entire economy seems to rest on a single pastime. This isn't going to be an issue for everyone, and it's a kid's game, I get it, but it's played exhaustingly straight in my opinion. The fixation on Pokemon is normal in that world, forever saddled as it is with the priorities and complexities of a 90s era playground. It just felt like background noise to me at the time, and I'm sure that's all it was intended to be. But then I played Bugsnax and saw how this type of single-mindedness, in the right hands, can be utilised to aid the storytelling, rather than feeling like filler. In that game, the snacks fulfill a need similar to addictive substances. The characters want them for various reasons, to help them get stronger, to inspire them, sometimes just to feel better. They are both a vice and a crutch. Contextualizing Bugsnax in this way means that having almost all the quests and dialogue revolve around them, and having the well-being of the community seemingly relying on them too, feels justified. All these characters are here for a reason. Whatever their lives were before moving to the island, they were unfulfilling enough to have been left behind. And in that empty space where a life used to be, they're packing in the snacks. This contextualization is enough to transform the repetitive nature of the framework and the dialogue, because it's enhancing the story and its world, and reinforcing the game's core themes rather than making it feel underdeveloped. It works especially well because we as the audience can recognize the unhealthy patterns in their behavior, because they mirror self-destructive choices made by real people. It's one of the first clues about the underlying darkness of the game's story, but it's easy to overlook at first if we view it with that Pokemon it's just filler mindset, and I'm sure that's by design. Of course, I'm not saying Pokemon needs to be darker. Sure, I'd like a return to that Lavender Town style of creepiness from back in the day, but they don't make this stuff for me. What I am saying though is that with a modicum of self-awareness, Pokemon could do something fresh with its plot. Black and White with its animal rights spin sort of tried this, and while I'll give them kudos for the attempt, it seemed to me like a half step that wasn't really wildly different to the other games in the end. Instead of something like that, imagine a Pokemon game where the popularity of battling has plummeted. The region has mostly moved on, but you as the player set out on a journey to reignite interest in the dying art of making wild animals punch each other. The gyms are closed, Poke Centers are kept on life support by charitable funding, and the Elite Four all work at a Costco now. One became manager, and the other three hate them for it. I'm half joking, but that simple tweak, this idea of Pokemon not being the be-all and end-all in every corner of the world, opens up way more narrative and gameplay potential than sticking to the established formula again and again. That framework could even justify a new rarity for Pokeballs, which might in turn help justify having to do something more interesting than hitting one button to catch your creatures. Maybe Pokemon Arceus, I don't know how you say it, will be the dramatic shift longtime fans are hoping for, but probably not. Time will tell, and I'll be interested to see if that game ends up doing something unique. Anyway, this was all one long deception to get you to play Bugsnax, so please go do that and then come back here and tell me how great it was. Okay, bye.
Do the wiggle with me. I do the wiggle with me. Yeah! Eh? Is somebody there? You didn't hear anything, pal. You got that? Not a single peep!